I'm Asanni Armon. I use they, them, she, her, he, him pronouns. I have no preference. I am the founder of FTG For The Gworls, which is a collective that parties and fundraises funds on behalf of Black trans people. We use it to pay for Black trans people's rent, their gender affirming surgeries, also smaller copays for procedures and stuff like that, as well as travel assistance back and forth to medical facilities. And yeah, these last few weeks have been a whirlwind, but really in the best way.
Very good, thank you. Hi everyone, my name is Joshua Allen. I use they and them pronouns. I'm from Brooklyn, New York City. I'm the founding organizer of the Black Excellence Collective. I'm a member of the 2020 Resist Foundation's funding group. I'm currently working on my debut book, a collection of prose and poetry titled All the Things I Never Said. And I'm also a writer, a public speaker, and I model part-time too. The last few weeks have been super intense. Myself and many other organizers here in New York City and across the country have been doing this work to uplift LGBT communities, specifically trans, gender nonconforming, and non-binary communities within our larger movements for social justice. It's been an uphill battle, but it feels like finally we're getting some much overdue attention. We're receiving and I think a lot of the organizers are finally receiving the flowers for all the work that we've been doing for so long. The pandemic and the crisis around the uprisings right now are showing that the work that Black, trans, and queer people have been doing is so instrumental to our movements for justice. And so I'm really glad to be here and in conversation with my dear friend Asanni today to talk about these issues that we've been going through long before today, and to figure out some great solutions moving forward in the future. Actually, I just had a chance to read your fabulous write-up in Forbes today, Asanni, and you mentioned this topic. I wonder if you can share more of your insights on this.
Yeah, I mean, like Josh said, we've been organizing for years, right? We've been doing this work for years, and so it does feel like for years it's kind of been swept under the rug, and has been kind of largely ignored by the larger movements. And that's not okay. But as Black trans organizers, you kind of come to understand that regardless of whether or not people are paying attention, you still have work to do. And so we've still just been doing that work. So now that the spotlight is like finally honing in on like Black trans organizers and the work that we've been doing and uplifting for years, it's overwhelming to come all at once. But at the same time, it's important that like we use this moment to really amplify the stuff that we've been doing for years, because these issues have been around for years. And so now that people are paying attention, it's important to kind of hone in on that and like drive it home that these are the things that need to change, and these are the things that need to change now, and these are the ways that they can change. Here are like tangible solutions to issues that have existed well before Josh and I were even born. So that's a long-winded way of saying it's been overwhelming, but it's welcome now, because now it's as good of a time to plug in and really help push the world forward and really actually change the world in tangible ways.
Definitely. And then I think even just bouncing off of this is work that's been going on for a long time, but I think the issues of today are illuminating the need for those who have been most marginalized in our movement to finally be brought to the center. As we've been seeing in the police killings, the systematic pattern of police brutality in our system of mass incarceration, we see that women, that trans people, and queer people in the Black community are disproportionately affected by these issues that we're facing. Although our faces, our stories, and our issues have not been at the forefront of the movement. I think one of the ways that we can keep a sustained pattern of resistance and keep this momentum up well beyond this summer, well beyond this year, is to think about how we can continuously center those who have been most marginalized in our community. And I believe that when those who have been the most marginalized finally have ways to be cared for, to be seen, to be nurtured, to be supported, and we don't just start caring about their lives after something bad has happened, when we really start organizing and shaping out a society where people have access to the most basic of human rights, things like housing, which Asanni works on with For The Gworls, things like healthcare, things like food security, these building blocks that really kind of require a fundamental shift in resources, attention, time, and care in our societies are going to be the way that we keep up that sustained momentum and make change for our futures and for generations to come.
Absolutely.
Asanni, I want you to talk a little bit more about the work that you're doing with For The Gworls and the specific attention you all are facing, spending on the issues of housing and healthcare, and then maybe even share more about the local ecosystem that we have here in New York City, Black trans-led organizations, and what issues are you all tackling at this time?
Yeah, absolutely. So FTG we started because there were two people in my life that needed rent assistance, right? They were two people who were facing eviction and they needed help. And so I threw a party, and that led to me deciding to throw more parties, with the end goal of like taking the ticket sales from those parties to help people, right? And so that speaks to a larger issue of like houselessness for Black trans people, which is at an all-time high, right? Especially even now during the pandemic, but well before that. It also speaks to joblessness and how Black trans people are being discriminated on multiple levels when it comes to job to obtaining jobs because of discrimination, because of anti-Blackness, and on an institutionalized level, transphobia on an institutionalized level, right? And really no protection in place to really tangibly help Black trans people if they face some type of discrimination when it comes to the hiring process, or even once they are hired, actually maintaining that job. And so I think that with FTG comes in is like a really great intervention, because we know that joblessness and having a job really is so intimately intertwined to having healthcare that really helps people maintain their health. And so if you do not have one, more often than not, you do not have the other. And so FTG kind of comes in as a fail-safe for Black trans people and helps with paying your rent if you are not able to pay your rent because of not having a job or whatever circumstances that might come up. And then also helping with gender affirming surgeries and other co-pays for procedures and medicine and stuff like that, because you might not have access to that in a safe way because you don't have a job.
Yeah, and then maybe even I'll just piggyback off of you and talk a little bit more about the other organizations that are doing work in a similar vein here in New York City. So back in 2015, myself and Cece McDonald started the Black Excellence Collective, which is really meant to be an organizing space specifically for and by young Black, queer, and trans people, non-binary people, to organize for our collective liberation. The original framework was that we would use things like art, direct action, and education in order to raise awareness around the issues that are going on in our community, and also to fight explicitly back against those. I'm also really excited about, in the last couple of years, the development of other organizations like the Okra Project that work specifically to challenge issues of food insecurity in our communities, and is kind of now branching more into making sure that people have access to healthcare. Asanni just mentioned the work that they've been doing with For The Gworls. There's Black trans femmes in the arts, who does work particularly around arts and media and performance for Black trans people. And then of course we've got the great work of Glitz Inc. here in New York City. It's gays and lesbians living in a transgender society, best name ever. And they've been doing really great work about helping people who have been recently released from incarceration reintegrate back into society. And this is something that has been an integral part of racial justice movements for so long. And unfortunately, trans and queer people were not included in this conversation. Now I'm so grateful for the work and the leadership of Cayenne Dorshow and the folks working at Glitz, because we're starting to expand the conversation of what it means to challenge recidivism, what it means to challenge a system of mass incarceration that over-incarcerates and criminalizes people for having everyday human issues. And so I'm really excited about the groundwork that's been done over the last few years, and really kind of looking forward to the radical potentials of the future with these organizations if we can be well-funded, well-supported, and uplifted to finally lead.
And to piggyback off of that, I also want to highlight Black Trans Travel Fund, which is an organization that helps get Black trans women specifically to and fro via a ride share, so that we can cut down on violence against Black trans women that happens in subway cars and subway stations, on the street. They're doing amazing work. And I also want to highlight the Angelito Collective, which is an amazing organization that is actually throwing their first big event on Sunday. And they are like using their money to donate to Black trans orgs in Brooklyn and also in Columbia as well.
Also, yeah, people will want to be at their virtual event this weekend, because so many of the hosts of the event and the organizers of it are super attractive too. It's Pride season. Well, I'll definitely be marching. Are you going to try to come out, Asanni, or are you going to be holding it down in another way?
Well, I plan on coming out in the event that I'm not able to come out because I'm immunocompromised. And as always, I'll be doing cop support and jail support and bail fund support and stuff like that if that is a need. Hopefully that's not a need, and hopefully I will be able to hit the streets, but I haven't fully decided yet. Similar to what Josh was saying, I think that what that looks like is having this access to bare necessities, right? And to me, I think bare necessities includes, but are not limited to, right? Being able to afford, being able to have a job, right? Being able to pay your rent, to have affordable health care, be able to afford food on your table, be able to pay for basic necessities. I think those are just basic rights that all people should have, right? But definitely Black, queer, and trans people, who are more often than not the ones that don't have it at all. But I think beyond that, right, liberation looks like not having to worry about police trying to take you to jail or trying to arrest you because you look a certain way, right? Not having to worry about police brutality and death at the hands of the state, right? And on the other end of that, not having to worry about death by community members, right? Black, cis people who might feel a reason to violate you for whatever reason, not having to worry about that type of violence either. I think that black queer liberation looks like total safety in every sense of the word, and security in every sense of the word.
Definitely. I mean, I 100% agree with that. And I think all the time about what Asada Shakur says about what freedom is. You know, it's the ability to live and to thrive is exactly who you are. I'm echoing your sentiments of wanting a world where we can live free without the threat of violence, where we can survive, but also in a world where we can thrive as well. You know, for generations, our communities have survived. You know, so many of us who exist today, we are the direct result of generations and generations of our ancestors who survived despite all the odds stacked up against them. And this is the kind of the legacy that we come from, and the fight and the resistance that we kind of have a mandate to carry on. And I think that it's important that we don't just emphasize the survival piece. You know, we're there, we're living proof of the survival of our people. But I think that the important next step is to create a society in which all of us could thrive. And so in some of the very simple ways in our society that can manifest is the abolition of prisons and police. That the systems that disproportionately impact and strip us, black people, black queer people, and trans people of freedom, we need to get rid of those systems. So the abolition of prisons, the abolition of police, the reparation of our communities in order to finally grapple with the racialized wealth divide in this country. There are so many different structural things that we need to change, resources that we need to shift among our society. And really the key point here is creating a society in where black, queer, and trans people, and by extension, all people in the society around us, have access to the very basic needs of humanity that include, and we'll keep saying it, education, housing, fresh water, healthcare, and so much more. It's about living a dignified life without the threat of violence, and also one in which we could thrive.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And beyond that, right, have access to live where they want to live. So, like, not just in a US centric way, but like the collapse of borders, right? Like how that contributes to the oppression and the murders of black, queer, and trans people who are largely left out of the conversations of immigration, around immigration. But that's equally as important, right? Should be able to walk down the street, any street that you so choose to live.
Absolutely. And I think this is a narrative that we need to continue to raise throughout the rest of this week and throughout the weekend, as well as we celebrate Pride. You know, for those of us living here in America, while life is not easy for us, we do experience a relative level of privilege in comparison to so many people of our same race, people of different races, and also of the same background in the queer and trans community all over the world. You know, I've been privileged to work with migrants making the transmigration journey from Central America through Mexico into the United States border, and to see the very specific issues that they face and the parallels between those in our community here. I think it's time for all of us to be liberated together. You know, the liberation and the freedom of one group of people is tied to the rest of the world. And so I think we have to, like you said, collapse those borders and think about how we operate in solidarity with people who really, the regions like Central America, even the labor of Mexico, it has been exploited and stripped of all of its resources in order to make the U.S. empire rich, in order to give us the luxuries and the privileges that we have today. We need to start thinking actively and creatively about how we repair the harm in those communities, and how the resources and the power with which we invest and build our society is not used to continue the domination of others abroad. And so thanks for bringing that point up, Asanni. It's extremely important that we work in solidarity with trans communities, black, indigenous, and people of color all over the world to achieve our collective liberation.
And right. And I like that you brought up the fact, right? Well, thank you. And I like the fact that you brought up the need to get resources to them, right? Because then we get into a conversation about capitalism, and we get into a conversation about how when we are taking resources in the U.S., we, as the U.S., are taking resources from people in the global South and Central America and all these other places. Then we talk about how capitalism is inherently evil and capitalism is inherently draining. In order to sustain one place, you have to drain someone and somewhere of something, of resources, right? And so then we get into the conversation of the need for capitalism or the non-need for capitalism, and why we need to be trying to eradicate that, and how all of our systems of oppression, when we talk about anti-blackness and racism, white supremacy, transphobia, patriarchy, and we talk about all those things are intimately tied to capitalism, and how people's deaths, black people's deaths, black queer people, black trans people's deaths are literally building and sustaining capitalism and sustaining resources being taken from other places. And in order to stop all of it, in order to get to the end of all of it, it is ridiculously necessary to get rid of capitalism in its entirety.
Absolutely. And that's definitely a part of the, if we didn't mention it explicitly when we're talking about what our vision for queer liberation looks like, an anti-capitalist society where no one is exploited for their labor in order to privilege few over the needs of the many. I think that's a central tenet to our ideas of our collective liberation.
The distinction is that I put money in people's hands directly. And so, like, I'm laughing, but I'm serious. Like, the distinction is that FTG puts money in people's hands directly, right? Like, I understand the way tax systems work, and I understand that it is much easier to figure out all these other ways to get resources to people, or really, if we're talking about larger NGOs, collect resources and make it seem like you're getting resources to people when really you're not. But really, if you are in it to do this work, then you understand that what people need is what they tell you they need. And what they tell you they need is what you should be delivering. And that's it. I'm not in this game to be paternalistic and to tell anybody, this is how you should be doing things. No, I let people come to me and tell me this is what they need, this is how much they need, this is when they need it by, and we get that money directly to them, right? And so that's the difference between like the work that I do with a lot of these bigger organizations that claim they do work, but they actually don't, or they try to find other ways to get resources to people that will not affect their tax status. I'm luckily in a position where I am fiscally sponsored, so I don't have to really worry about tax status as much. And working with that fiscal sponsor in creative and unique ways to make sure that they're not compromised while I'm also still able to directly put money in people's hands.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. I really appreciate that. And I think the question is really important. So I'll make a brief story time about me. When I was 19 years old, I got my first salary job as an organizer at this nonprofit here in New York City. The nonprofit had a mission of kind of like empowering and educating LGBTQ youth of color ages 16 to 24 here in the city. And so it kind of felt like the perfect fit for me. I'm a young person. I'm from the city. I'm well connected in the LGBT community, and I like to think of myself as a leader and a model for the kind of way that we should be trying to kind of look out for each other, educate each other, and make changes in the world around us. And the overwhelming function of the nonprofit and most hierarchical organizations across this country under a capitalist system, the overwhelming function of these budgets and the programs is to compensate high-level staff. And so the majority of the budget at maybe it was like 40 to 45% of the entire organization's yearly budget just went to the executive director. And then the next largest chunk after that went to the salary of the organizing director. And then the next largest chunk after that went to the program needs of our flagship education program. And then me and the other staff members were being paid minimum wage to do this work. And so I guess the idea in many of the nonprofits across this country is to preserve a new professional managerial class that's been created under the nonprofit industrial complex. And if people aren't familiar with that phrasing, it really kind of is indicative of the kind of co-optation of movements in order to further advance profit for individuals and institutions across this country and across the world. And so that was, like I said, it was my first salary job. I was really excited and motivated, and I had lots of ambition about the possibilities of the impact that I can make in my community from this position. And I spent maybe 9 or 10 months there, and it was one of the biggest wastes of time that I've ever spent in my life. I mean, of course, I met really awesome people, and I had a chance to do some cool things, but after a certain point, you begin to realize that the work that you're doing, the labor you're expending, is not for the overall empowerment of your people. It's in order to increase the bottom line of the budget every year, in order to better compensate this professional managerial class. And I think this is why we have both been so inspired to go a different route. Like I said, the organization that I founded back in 2015 with CC McDonald, we have not gone the 501c3 route, and we haven't tried to start our own nonprofit. We have also been working with the fiscal sponsor in order to keep us in a grassroots fashion to work well and without so many strings and barriers in the way with our communities. And just like Asanni said, I think that the direct transfer of resources to Black people and Black communities in this time is of the utmost importance. So much more important than paying the salary of people whose job it is to kind of sit around and spin in circles all day. And so I'm really excited and optimistic about the all the new ways that we can imagine to keep each other safe, to protect each other, and to look after each other. I mean, even just looking back at the pieces in the months of the coronavirus pandemic we've had so far. I mean, the government, our nonprofit systems, our education systems, they literally were razed to the ground. And all of the supportive systems and mechanisms that we should have had in place in the wealthiest nation of the world completely fell on itself. And all the resources from our tax dollars went to go support the richest people in the world, and those of us who need the support the most were left on our own. It's time for us to radically reimagine the function of our government, the function of our nonprofits, and the function of our industry. So whereas they're not a part of our exploitation, really their resources need to be radically redirected into the hands of individuals who are suffering under the hands of these issues that the nonprofits purport to care about. And I think that in our conversation about abolition, the nonprofit industrial complex needs to be towards the top of the list.
Absolutely, absolutely. The nonprofit industrial complex is a byproduct of capitalism, right? And it's neoliberal in this idea that like we're different, we are doing things different. We actually care about the people. It's the corporations that don't care about people. We, on the other hand, we really care. This is what our mission statement is. This is how much money we've raised. But it's never this is how much money we've given, right? It's never this is how many things we've done. It's always this is how much money we've raised. And I think that that's where a lot of nonprofits get off is that they get to end the conversation right there, because then I guess we are supposed to assume, well, this means that this money is going towards this mission statement, and that's rarely ever the case, right? It's really this money is going to the CEO and whoever else and all these other people. And meanwhile, the people who need the money the most are still homeless, still struggling to pay their bills, still all these things that they should never have to experience, because there's more than enough money in the world to go around. There's more than enough resources in the world to go around to make sure that nobody in the world, in the entire world, is homeless and without resources. And so, absolutely, the nonprofit industrial complex is at the top of the list with the big corporations. When it's time for all of this to burn, they have to go as well.
This is really essential to our mission of Black liberation, because it's not just about the kind of the faulty structure of the nonprofit industrial complex. Really, what it is also about the systemic and also the interpersonal harm that it has caused in our communities. I mean, there's been so much research done, there's so much literature, there's been so much culture creation, and even academic literature written about the cycle of exploitation and abuse of Black women in the nonprofit system. There's been so much literature, both academic and also kind of peer-to-peer, that's been created around the exploitation of trans issues in the nonprofit industrial complex. And so when we think about the systemic forces that cause oppression in our communities, it's not just as narrow as police brutality. It doesn't exist in a vacuum of explicit outbursts of anti-Black racism. It's a systemic pattern that runs the gamut from the nonprofit industrial complex to the healthcare industry, to our education system, to our housing industry, to our banking industry, and to our government. It runs the entire span of the gamut. And so I think it's just really important to raise that it's not like the nonprofits kind of went wayward. It's that they have been a result of a concerted effort from capitalist institutions all over this country to keep poor and working class people, particularly those of us from Black and Indigenous communities, people of color communities, queer and trans communities, oppressed. And that's why it's so important for us to make sure that we have an anti-capitalist message at the heart of our Black liberationist politics.
One of the things that people have been asking a lot in these interviews, right, is like, what does pride mean to you? What does pride mean, especially with all these protests happening around Black lives and, et cetera, et cetera. And I want to really drive home the fact that, like, beyond just saying pride was a riot, because now at that point, that's become a token phrase, right? We know that pride was a riot. I think that I want to be very clear about the fact that every month that Black people have had to walk in a place that was other than Africa because they were stolen from Africa, that is a fight. That is the month that people were fighting for Black lives. And similarly, that means that every Pride Month is a fight for Black lives, not just because George Floyd died this last month, and people started protesting last month and this month, not because Tony Dade and Dominique Remy Fells and Ryan Milton were killed this month, which are important names to highlight, right? But every Pride Month, Black trans people are being murdered. Every Pride Month, Black queer people are being murdered. Every Pride Month, Black, queer, and trans people are trying to figure out and navigate housing and navigate joblessness and homelessness, right? Every Pride Month is a fight for Black livelihood. And that is the case last year. That will be the case next year. That will be the case 10, 15, and 20 years from now. And I think that I want to drive home the fact that we need to continue always censoring Black, trans, and queer people's voices when we're talking about that fight, because that fight is a fight for not just their lives, but for all queer lives. We have not got to the progress that people believe that we've gotten to, right? When we talk about what's happening right now in this particular moment, we have to look back at what Marsha P. Johnson was telling us decades ago. She told us to not be confused by the legislation that will be passed, that will inevitably be passed, because the government will always give us an inch. They will always continue to give us an inch and tell us that we should be grateful that we've gotten that inch. We should never be grateful to get an inch. We should be fighting for our lives, and we should be fighting for the mile, because we deserve the mile. We are people. We are humans. We deserve the mile, right? And so I would want to drive home the fact that we cannot be distracted by legislation passing and small wins. We are too big of a community, and we are too beautiful of a people to be pleased with small wins and landmark passing. We need to be fighting and continuing to fight every month beyond Pride Month. But specifically, if we're talking about Pride and we're talking about queer liberation, we're talking about marching and rioting, we need to be specifically fighting for Black, queer, and trans lives every Pride. Because until we can stop the murders of Black trans women and femmes, until we can stop the murders of Black trans masculine people and trans men, until we can stop homelessness and joblessness in the Black, queer, and trans community, then we have not gotten the progress that we say that we have gotten.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think the point that I would just want to drive home ahead of Sunday's action, and I want it to be a present part of the spirit of the action on Sunday as well. And I say this all the time. It's like the kind of nexus of the work that I do, and the kind of genesis of the Black Excellence Collective, is the fact that Black, queer, and trans people have been instrumental in the development of wealth and value in every industry across the world, from the industries of fashion, of beauty, of science, of academia, of literature, you name it, we've been a part of it. And we've added value to the tune of billions and trillions of dollars across the decades. Although our communities are instrumental in creating culture and being the warriors, the cultural creators, the leaders, the nurturers, the caretakers, the movement leaders, although we've been instrumental in those positions of leadership, the wealth, the power, and the value that we've generated for the societies around us are never found reflected in our communities. I think it's really important that this year, especially in the radical nature of Pride and the unruly and riotous nature and history and legacy that we're serving and we're honoring in this season, we need to radically reimagine how those people who are the most valuable contributors, the essential workers of our society, so to say, are finally uplifted and valued in the way that we should have always been. This is what we're fighting for this weekend. This is the message behind Pride. This is what we're standing for. This is the line we're drawing in the sand. And I think it's important now more than ever that the communities that have been erased and invisibilized are finally brought to the fore.